Hello everybody and welcome back to BeginnerJS. I'm Abrar and I'm going to be your instructor for this video. And in this video, we're going to be talking about variables. Now variables are widely used in JavaScript programming, and thus it's essential that you understand the concept of variables. So let's see how they work. Okay, so what are exactly variables and why do we need them in JavaScript? Well, variables in their simplest form are basically containers that you can use to store values. Now in programming, a lot of the time you'll be using values that you need to reuse over and over again. You'll be creating a value or calculating a value, retrieving a value from someplace, and then you'll need to reuse that value, reference it, and mention it a number of times in your code. Now if you redefine that value every time you have to mention it, not only will it take a lot of time, but it won't be very efficient. And for big values, every time you define the value, JavaScript will have to recreate it, and that might take a lot of time and decrease performance. That is where variables come in. When you have a value that you need to reuse over and over again in your code, you can just create a variable and store that value in the variable. After you create the variable and store the specific value, that variable will contain that value, which means that value is pretty much replaceable with the variable name, and thus every time you need to reference that or reuse that value, you can just use the variable name instead. And by doing this, you'll be improving your code's performance and also make your code a lot cleaner and a lot less messier. And that is how variables are used. Let's see an example of how this actually works. Okay, so first we have a code that says var x and then a semicolon. By doing this, we are creating a variable named x. So how exactly does this work? Well, in JavaScript, in order to create a variable, we need to use the var keyword. The var keyword declares a variable. So in this case, we're using the var keyword to declare a new variable. So after you write the var keyword, you put a space and then you put the variable name. Every variable must need a name, and that name must be a unique identifier in your code. In this case, we want a variable named x. That's why we type in var and then a space and then x. Finally, we end the statement with a semicolon. And by doing that, we have created a variable called x. Now we did declare a name of variable. However, this variable doesn't really contain any specific value. Because we just created it, we haven't assigned any value to this yet, and thus the value of x currently is undefined. However, we can assign a value to this variable, and then that variable will contain that specific value. And that's how you can use variables to store values for reuse later on. So how can you do that? Let's see. Okay, so here what we're doing is typing in x and then equals 5. Finally, we're ending the statement with a semicolon. So what exactly is going on here? Well, by doing this, we have assigned the value, the number 5, to the variable x. So x now equals 5. Now, if you're familiar with algebra, this will be very familiar because in algebra 2, we have variables. For example, in math, we often use variables named x, y, z or a, b, c. And in those cases, variables are often used as placeholders for values that we don't know yet. In JavaScript, variables are more used to store values. They can be used as containers for storing values. And in this case, we are just assigning a different value to this variable. This is very similar to how you do it in basic algebra. You type in the variable name, then an equal sign, and then the value that you want to assign to the variable. And in JavaScript, we end the statement with a semicolon. So here, x equals 5 and then a semicolon means now the value of the variable x has been changed from undefined to 5. And now you can actually check that by typing in the variable name. For example, if you type in x and then semicolon, the output result would be 5. And that proves that x currently has the value, the number 5. And that is how variables work. You can declare a variable and then you can use it to store values. Now what's cool is this variable called x will contain the value, the number 5, as long as it's not changed. So up until the point you assign a different value to this variable, variable x will always contain the value 5. And whenever you need to reuse or reference this value again, you can use the variable name instead of the value. So if you want to input 5, you can input x in place of that. And that will actually improve the performance of your code when you'll be working with much bigger values and you'll be reusing them and referencing them over and over again in your code. Now that's not the only way of actually declaring and assigning values to variables. In the first example, we had two lines of code. First we declare the variable using var x, and then we assign a value to the variable in the second line by typing in x equals 5. However, you can also use a shorthand and do these two things together. You can declare and assign a value to the variable in the same line or statement. In order to do that, you first have to declare the variable using the var keyword. So we have var, and then the variable name. In this case, the variable name will be y, so we type in var y. But then instead of ending the statement, you can continue on and actually assign a value to it. So you can type in var y equals and then a value that you want to assign to that variable. Now in this case, we have var y equals 4 plus 6 and then a semicolon to end the statement. This illustrates how you can actually assign expressions as values to variables and not just hard values. So just like x equals 5 is a valid variable assignment, so is y equals 4 plus 6. And in that case, JavaScript will actually calculate the value of 4 plus 6, which equals 10, and that will be the value of the variable y. Again, it's very similar to basic algebra. In algebra 2, we have things such as a variable name equals a number plus or minus another number. And that's the same thing that's going on here. We have y equals 4 plus 6. So when this statement is executed, JavaScript will first calculate the value of the expression, which is 4 plus 6 equals 10, and that will be assigned as the value to the variable y. So now variable y will contain the value 10. And if you type in the variable name, say y, and then a semicolon, the output result would be 10. And thus the variable y will contain the value 10, unless it's changed later on. Now here's another thing. In algebra and mathematics, we work with numbers, and thus variables usually contain values that are numbers. However, in JavaScript, we don't have that restriction. In JavaScript, variables can contain a lot of different types of values. They can contain not only numbers, but also strings, booleans, and a lot of other data types like arrays and objects that we'll talk about later on. So in this case, for example, we have y equals the string I love mountains, and then a period symbol or dot, and then a semicolon to end the statement. Now this is a perfectly valid statement in JavaScript. Here we're just writing y equals I love mountains, the string. Now in this case, two things are going on here. First of all, we're assigning a string as a value to a variable. And this works very similar to how you'd assign numbers. You just type in the variable name, then an equal sign, and then a string value, or whatever value that you want to store inside the variable. And now variable y will contain the string I love mountains. So if you type in y and then a semicolon, then the resulting output would be the string I love mountains. And that is how variables work. And you can actually store strings, booleans, and a lot of other types of values inside variables, not just numbers. Another thing that you'll notice is that we're not declaring a different variable. We already declared the variable called y in the previous statement, and in this statement, we're just changing the value of the same variable. That's another thing. Variable values can be changed. They're not permanent. So even after you declare a variable and assign it a value, that value is not permanent. It can be changed or reassigned. So variable y is being reassigned a different value. So previously y was equal to 4 plus 6 or y was equal to 10. However, in this statement, we are changing the value of the variable y to string I love mountains. And now the value of variable y has been changed from the number 10 to the string I love mountains. And that is how variables work. You can declare them and you can assign different values to them as you please. Now, when it comes to naming variables, there are a few rules and restrictions. For example, variable names must start with a letter, the $sign, or an underscore, and subsequent characters can only contain letters, $signs, underscores, or numbers. So in this case, for example, we have a few valid variable names. For example, var x is obviously a valid variable name. Another valid variable name would be $text. That is also a valid variable name. Using the $sign in variable names is perfectly fine. However, it might cause some confusions, so be careful with that. Another thing that you can do is use underscores. So underscore b is another valid variable name. However, again, starting a variable name with an underscore character is a convention often followed in other libraries which can cause confusion. And lastly, you can use numbers in variable names as long as they are not the first character. So for example, the variable named n3 is a perfectly valid variable name as well because it contains a number, however it's not the first character. Now in case you're wondering, why can't we start a variable name with a number? Like what's the problem with that? Why do we need a letter, $sign, or underscore in order to start a variable name? And that answer lies on how JavaScript treats variable names and numbers. Now as you'll see, in JavaScript, we just type in the variable names as is, without any special designation or characters. And that's the same thing for numbers. We just type in the numbers as is, without any special designation. So if in JavaScript you were allowed to start variable names with letters, then JavaScript would get confused as to if you had a variable name such as 3n, for example, then when you typed in 3n, JavaScript would get confused as to whether you're referring to 3 the number or just 3n the variable name. And that would create confusion. And that is why in JavaScript you can't start variable names with numbers. You can only use letters, dollar signs, or underscores. In most cases, it's better to just use normal letters or characters. And in some cases, if required, you can use numbers as subsequent characters. Also, you should keep the variable names short, rememberable, and also representative of the variable values that they contain. So here are some examples of invalid variable names. For example, var3b is an invalid variable name because it starts with a number, and that would create confusions with normal numbers themselves. That's why you can't start a variable name with numbers. Similarly, the variable named class is also invalid. Why is that? Because along with these rules, you also can't use special keywords as variable names in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we actually have a lot of keywords, and these keywords are used to designate or mark or declare different things. For example, the keyword var is a keyword itself. These are special keywords which have different meanings in JavaScript. The word class, similarly, is a special keyword which has a different meaning in JavaScript. And that is why you can't use it as a variable name, because if you did, then JavaScript would get confused when you refer to the variable name as whether you're referring to the variable or whether you're referring to the class keyword, which has a different special meaning. That is why you can't use reserved keyword names as variable names in JavaScript. And also you can't use special characters, for example, hello and s. The and character in this case is invalid. You can only use letters, dollar signs, and underscores, and even numbers as long as they're not the first character. However, you can't use any other characters besides these. So you can't name variables hello and s, because that would cause a syntax error. In fact, all of these three variable names would cause syntax errors. These are not valid variable names. Another quick thing that you'll notice is that we are actually declaring multiple variables on the same line. That is also something you can do easily in JavaScript. So for example, if you want to declare multiple variables, you can separate them by a comma. So in this case, if you want to declare variables, you don't necessarily have to type in var x, then a semicolon, then the next line var y, semicolon, and then the next line var z, semicolon. You can actually declare all the variables in the same line by separating them by a comma. So in this case, you can type in var x, comma y, comma z, and then a semicolon, and that will create three variables named x, y, and z. That is exactly what we're doing here as well. We have var x, comma dollar sign text, comma underscore b, comma n3. And by separating these variable names with a comma, we can declare multiple variables in the same line, which can save you a lot of time and hassle if you're declaring a lot of variables. Now that you know what variables are and how they work, let's see some variable usage and examples to completely understand and grasp the concept of variables. For a start, we'll declare a variable named text. So we'll type in var text, and then we'll assign the value I love the string to this variable. So we can type in var text equals the string I love, and then a semicolon to end the statement. So first we have declared a variable called text and which contains the value I love. Okay, so far so good. Now let's declare another variable called m. So in this case, var m would equal the string mountains, then a semicolon to end the statement. So we have two variables called text and m, and they contain the values the strings I love and mountains respectively. So variable text has a value the string I love, and variable m has a value the string mountains. Okay, so what's next? Okay, so now as you can see, we have typed in text plus then a string with a white space plus m, and the resulting output, as you can see on the right hand side inside the comments, is the string I love mountains. So how exactly does this work? What's going on here? Well, as I said, variables are basically containers for storing values. If you have a value that you want to store and reuse multiple times, you can declare a variable and assign it that value. And after you assign the value to a variable, that variable name contains the value, and if you refer to that variable name, you're basically referring to the value internally. So in this case, whenever we type in text, it's basically the same as typing in the string I love. And whenever we type in m, it's basically the same as typing in the string mountains, because those are the values that they represent and contain. So in this case, whenever we type in text plus a string with white space and then plus m, we're basically typing in the string I love plus the string with a white space plus mountains. And when we add these three strings with the plus operator or the addition operator, these three strings are added together or concatenated together side by side. So the result in this case is first the value of the variable text, so I love, then an empty white space, so I love, then an empty white space, and then the value of the variable m, which is mountains. And thus the output is the string I love mountains. That is how you can use variables in real life. Variables can be used in place of their values, because variables can be used to refer to those same values. So whenever you need to refer to those values, you can type in the variable name instead of hard-coding the values themselves. Now there is another way that you can do that, and that is by using what JavaScript calls template literals. Now template literals are a type of strings which have a few different characteristics. One of them is that you can embed variable names right inside them without using the addition operator or the plus sign. So here, for example, we're declaring another variable called t. So var t equals a template string. Now in JavaScript, template literals are actually starts and ends with a character called the backtick. So while this might look like a single quote, this is not. Single quotes or double quotes are used for normal strings. For template literals, we use the backtick character. So a template literal is designated using a backtick character. At the start we have a backtick character, and at the end we have another backtick character. And then in between these two backtick characters is where we type in the value of the string. And the cool thing is that we can actually embed variable values right inside these strings using a special syntax. And that special syntax is the $sign and then a pair of curly braces. And inside this pair of curly braces is where you can actually input expressions or just about any JavaScript code. And that code will be executed, and the result will be actually embedded inside the string, and the output will be the string with that embedded value. So for example, here we have a template literal with the value I love, then a space, and then the special embedding syntax. In this case, we type in the $sign and then a pair of curly braces. And inside the pair of curly braces is where we input the JavaScript code. In this case, we just input the variable name m. So in this case, when this code is executed, JavaScript actually calculates the value of the variable m. Now in this case, the variable m contains the value, the string mountains, and that's what the variable m is replaced with inside the string. And of course, the $sign and the curly braces are removed. So the result is the same string, I love mountains. However, in this case, we used template literals in order to achieve this. So inside the template literal, that whole $sign, pair of curly braces, and of course everything inside the pair of curly braces, which is the variable name, are replaced with the string mountains. And thus the final result is the string I love mountains. And that is how template literals work. Now let's take a look at another example. So in this case, we'll declare another variable called y, and we'll assign it the value 4 plus 7t. So in this case, var y equals 4 plus 7t. And now the value of the variable y is 74, because 4 plus 7t is 74. So variable y currently contains the value, the number 74. Now what we're doing is we're declaring another variable called x, so var x, and we're assigning it the value y divided by 2. So as you can see in this case, you can use variable names pretty much anywhere in JavaScript. Whenever you need to refer to that specific value, you can use a variable name in place of the value. So here, for example, we could type in 74 divided by 2. However, because we have this value 74 as the value of the variable y, we can type in y divided by 2 as the value to the variable x. And now, when this code is executed, y is replaced with its value, 74. So y divided by 2 means 74 divided by 2, and 74 divided by 2 equals 37. And that is the final value that is assigned to the variable called x. So var x equals y divided by 2 means variable x now contains the value 37. And that is how you can use variables in JavaScript to store different values and reuse them later on.